A Tudor wife did not always lose when her husband chose another woman. Sometimes she removed them both from power. At first, the household only seemed tense, whispers in corridors, invitations changing quietly, servants watching more carefully than before. What looked like patience slowly turned into something far more deliberate. A silence, law, and reputation began to move the balance of authority. Behind stone walls and candlelit halls, alliances shifted, evidence gathered, and a woman once treated as powerless prepared to reshape her entire household. Tonight, we step inside a Tudor marriage where endurance became strategy and quiet patience turned into absolute control. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If a traveller had entered the stone courtyards of a Tudor manor on the morning of a wedding, the scene might have appeared warm and celebratory. Horses stood tied along the walls. Servants carried baskets of food through the great hall, and musicians tested their instruments, while guests gathered in groups of polite conversation. From a distance, it looked like the beginning of a love story. Yet the true purpose of such a wedding rarely centered on love. In Tudor England, noble marriages were arranged with a level of care that resembled political negotiations more than personal choices. Families discussed land boundaries, inheritance rights, and financial agreements long before the bride and groom exchanged a single word with each other. A marriage contract could determine the future of estates that had taken generations to build. The union of two individuals, therefore, represented something far larger. It was the merging of wealth, alliances, and influence. A single wedding might connect two houses that had previously competed for power. Fields, forests, and villages that once belonged to separate families could suddenly fall under a shared authority. Through marriage, the map of local power quietly shifted. For this reason, a Tudor wedding was watched closely by far more people than the couple themselves. Relatives observed, calculating how the new alliance might strengthen or weaken their own position. Neighbours studied the arrangement with interest, wondering whether the balance of influence in the region was about to change. Even servants understood that a marriage could alter the structure of the household in ways that affected their own lives. Within this structure, the legal wife occupied a role that appeared calm but carried enormous significance. She represented legitimacy. The church recognized her marriage as lawful, and society acknowledged the children she bore as the rightful heirs to the estate. Her presence provided continuity, ensuring that land, titles, and authority passed through an orderly line of inheritance. Without that legitimacy, the entire structure of a noble household could become unstable. Inheritance disputes were common in Tudor England, and they could drag on for years. Rival relatives might challenge the rights of children born outside formal marriage. Legal arguments could divide families and weaken estates. In such conflicts, the lawful wife stood at the center of the system that prevented chaos. Her role, therefore, carried symbolic weight. When visitors entered the manor hall and saw the wife seated beside her husband, the image communicated stability. The household appeared properly ordered. The future seemed secure, but beneath that calm appearance, the marriage remained a delicate political arrangement. The husband controlled the outward authority of the estate. His name appeared on legal documents and financial agreements. He spoke for the household in negotiations and disputes. His decisions shaped the family's relationship with the outside world. The wife's influence, by contrast, operated in quieter ways. She supervised the servants who maintained the daily rhythm of the estate. She oversaw the education of children who would one day inherit its lands. She managed the internal harmony of a household that that might contain dozens of people living under the same roof. Her authority was rarely loud, but it was constant. This arrangement created an impression of balance. The husband represented power in the public world, while the wife represented order inside the household. Together, they formed a structure that appeared stable enough to support generations. Yet such stability depended on a fragile agreement. Marriage joined two families, but it did not eliminate ambition, pride, or desire. Personal decisions made by the husband could ripple through the entire household. A careless alliance, an extravagant expense, or an inappropriate relationship could all disturb the careful equilibrium that the marriage was meant to maintain. In Tudor society, reputation carried immense weight. A noble family's standing depended not only on wealth, but also on public perception. If rumours spread about disorder within a household, rivals might exploit the weakness. Political allies could withdraw their support. Even loyal servants might begin to question their place within the structure. For this reason, appearances mattered almost as much as reality. A household that looked stable often remained stable, even when private tensions existed beneath the surface. As long as the marriage seemed intact, the political alliances built upon it continued to function. But once visible cracks appeared, the consequences could extend far beyond the walls of the manor. A noble marriage was therefore more than a personal bond. It was a structure holding together property, influence, and reputation. When that structure weakened, the effects could spread through families, estates, and local politics alike. Standing inside a Tudor Great Hall, surrounded by carved wooden beams and heavy stone walls, one might feel that the household was built to last for generations. Yet history repeatedly shows that even the strongest structures can shift when the people inside them begin to change their roles. And within those walls, the person expected to guard stability most carefully was often the wife herself. The marriage of a Tudor noble household appeared calm and orderly because it united property, legitimacy, and reputation under one carefully arranged structure. Yet structures built on alliances were never as unbreakable as they seemed. And sometimes, the first quiet crack formed not in the marriage contract, but in the patience of the woman expected to preserve it. The legal wife, in a Tudor household, lived in a position that appeared secure to everyone who looked from the outside. Her marriage was recognized by the church, recorded by law, and acknowledged by society as the legitimate foundation of the family's future. When guests entered the great hall and saw her seated beside her husband, the meaning of her presence was clear. She represented order, she represented legitimacy, and most importantly, she represented the lawful continuation of the family line. In a society where inheritance determined the fate of land, titles, and wealth, this role carried enormous importance. The children born to her marriage would inherit the estate. Their names would appear in documents, wills, and contracts that ensured the continuity of the household. Without a lawful wife, that continuity could collapse. Inheritance disputes were common in Tudor England. Distant relatives sometimes appeared with property claims, and families could spend years in court arguing over legal rights. The existence of a legitimate marriage prevented much of this chaos. It created a clear line of succession that others could not easily challenge. Because of this, the wife held a kind of authority that was both quiet and powerful. Yet that authority did not always protect her from personal difficulties within the marriage itself. A husband's actions could still disrupt the delicate balance of the household. Noblemen travelled frequently, attending court, managing estates, or negotiating alliances. In these spaces, they lived in a world filled with opportunity and temptation. Relationships outside marriage were not unheard of. In many cases, such affairs remained discreet enough that society chose to ignore them. As long as a public scandal did not erupt, people preferred to maintain the appearance of stability. This created a strange and uncomfortable expectation for the wife. She was expected to remain composed even when her husband's behavior caused private humiliation. Society praised dignity and restraint, and those qualities were most visible when a woman refused to react publicly to betrayal. Silence, therefore, became a defining part of her role, but silence was rarely understood correctly. To many observers, a quiet wife appeared weak. If rumors circulated about her husband's conduct and she did not respond with open anger, people sometimes assumed that she lacked the strength to defend her position. This interpretation overlooked the complexity of her situation. In reality, silence often required far more discipline than confrontation. A public accusation could damage the reputation of the entire household. Neighbors might gossip about conflict within the marriage. Political allies could begin to question the stability of the family. Even servants might lose confidence in the authority of the household if disorder became visible. For this reason, restraint protected more than personal pride. It protected the structure of the estate itself. A noble wife, therefore, learned to control her reactions carefully. She understood that her dignity rested not on emotional display, but on composure. Anger might satisfy a moment of pain, but patience preserves long-term influence. In many cases, patience was not passive at all. It was strategic. A woman who remained calm could observe the situation with clarity. Servants continued to trust her judgment. Relatives remained willing to support her. The household itself continued to function smoothly under her management. All of these advantages disappeared if she lost control in public. This ability to endure quietly often confused later observers. Modern readers sometimes imagine patience as submission, but Tudor wives frequently used patience as a way of gathering strength. They allowed time to reveal patterns that anger might obscure. Time was an important ally. A mistress relied heavily on the favor of a single man. Her influence existed only as long as his attention remained focused on her. The moment that attention shifted, her position could vanish quickly. The wife's position was very different. She stood inside a structure reinforced by law, family alliances, and religious recognition. Even if her husband's interests wandered temporarily, those institutions continued to support her legitimacy. Because of this, many wives waited. They observed changes in routine that others overlooked. A new name appears in household expenses. Gifts, leaving the estate accounts without explanation. Servants, whispering about visitors who arrived after dark. None of these details alone proved anything. But patience allowed details to accumulate. Imagine a quiet evening inside a Tudor manor. The servants have finished clearing the tables after supper, and the corridors of the house grow dim as candles burn low. The household settles into silence. In a small chamber near the private rooms of the family, the wife reviews the ledgers that record the estate's finances. The entries appear ordinary at first. Payments for grain shipments, wages for stable hands, repairs to a broken fence. The careful handwriting shows a routine that has repeated for years. Then a small difference appears. A sum of money has been withdrawn under circumstances that do not quite match the previous records. Perhaps the explanation is simple. Perhaps it is nothing. Or perhaps it is the first sign of something that patience will eventually reveal. The wife does not react immediately. She closes the ledger, extinguishes the candle beside her writing table, and returns to the quiet rhythm of the household. From the outside, nothing has changed. She continues to greet guests with courtesy. She attends church beside her husband. She oversees the servants with the same calm authority as before. But patience has begun to change its meaning. What once looked like endurance may slowly become observation. And observation, when guided by intelligence and time, can grow into something far more deliberate. The legal wife of a Tudor household appeared silent because dignity and restraint protected the stability of the family. Yet that silence allowed her to watch carefully, while others misunderstood her patience. And while many believed she was enduring quietly, Another presence was already beginning to test how far that patience could stretch. In many Tudor households, the presence of a mistress did not arrive with a dramatic announcement. It entered quietly, almost casually, like a small disturbance in a room that otherwise appeared calm. At first, it might take the form of a rumor whispered between servants, or a name mentioned a little too often in conversation. The change rarely revealed itself all at once. A husband might begin spending more time away from the estate, claiming business at court or visits to neighbouring lands. Letters arrived more frequently, sealed with unfamiliar wax. Small gifts disappeared from the household accounts without a clear explanation. Individually, these details seemed harmless, but within the delicate structure of a noble household, even small changes could carry meaning. The legal wife often noticed these patterns long before anyone spoke openly about them. She understood the rhythms of the estate better than most people. She knew which expenses were normal, which visitors were expected, and which habits belonged to her husband's ordinary routines. Because of this, the first signs of a mistress often appeared not as evidence, but as irregularities. A payment that could not be explained. A servant sent on an errand outside the estate without a clear purpose. A journey that lasted longer than usual. Still, the presence of a mistress was not always considered a scandal in Tudor society. At least not immediately. Men of rank sometimes maintained relationships outside marriage. And as long as those relationships remained discreet, many people chose to ignore them. The key word was discretion. When secrecy failed, the situation changed quickly. A mistress who remained hidden might be tolerated as a private weakness, but a mistress who became visible threatened the entire balance of the household. Her presence could begin to challenge the authority of the legal wife in ways that no one could easily ignore. The threat was not simply emotional, it was social. In Tudor England, reputation shaped every aspect of noble life. A wife's position depended on the perception that her marriage remained stable and respected. If another woman appeared openly connected to her husband, that perception could begin to weaken. Visitors might notice the shift in behavior. Servants might whisper more boldly about what they had seen. Neighbors might repeat rumors that traveled quickly between estates. Once such rumors spread, the consequences reached far beyond private embarrassment. A noble marriage represented an alliance between families. The wife's relatives had supported the union with the expectation that their daughter or sister would hold a respected place within the household. If that position appeared threatened, the entire alliance could feel unstable. Family members might begin to question the husband's behavior. Letters could arrive expressing concern disguised as polite curiosity. Invitations to gatherings might become less frequent. Conversations at court might include subtle hints that the household was losing its order. These changes could seem small at first, but small changes often accumulate into something larger. The appearance of a mistress also introduced a new tension inside the household itself. Servants, relatives, and advisors rarely remain neutral in such situations. Instead, they began to form quiet opinions about where loyalty should lie. Some servants remained loyal to the wife, respecting her authority and the legitimacy of her position. Others might seek favor with the husband, believing that supporting his interests could improve their own prospects. Gradually, the household divided into subtle factions. No one spoke openly about these divisions, but they could be felt in small gestures. A servant might hesitate before delivering a message. A relative might avoid certain conversations at the dinner table. Even the atmosphere of the great hall could begin to feel different. The mistress herself often stood at the center of this quiet disruption. She might not intend to challenge the household directly, yet her presence inevitably created tension. A gift from the husband could provoke whispers among servants. A public appearance beside him could raise uncomfortable questions. To the wife, these moments carried a particular weight. They suggested that what had once been a private matter was becoming visible to the world outside the household. And visibility was dangerous. Imagine a gathering inside the manor during an evening banquet. Candles illuminate the long wooden table while guests exchange polite conversation. The atmosphere appears calm, almost ceremonial. Then someone mentions a name that does not belong to the family. A brief silence follows. Most guests pretend not to notice the change. Yet the tension lingers in the air. The wife maintains her composure, responding with the same quiet dignity she always displays. But beneath that calm expression, she understands that the balance of reputation has begun to shift. A mistress who remains hidden might be ignored. A mistress who becomes visible forces the household to confront a new reality. And in Tudor society, such realities rarely remained confined to private life. What began as a personal relationship could slowly transform into a public challenge. It could affect alliances, influence the loyalty of servants, and disturb the careful image of stability that noble families worked so hard to maintain. The wife understood this better than anyone. She knew that the appearance of another woman was not merely an insult. It was a disruption capable of shaking the foundations of a marriage that had once been designed to secure power and order. The arrival of a mistress rarely began with open conflict. Yet, her presence slowly disturbed the fragile balance of reputation inside a Tudor household. What once appeared to be a private matter began to ripple outward, affecting family alliances and the loyalty of those who lived under the same roof. Soon, the quiet patience that protected the wife's dignity would face a test no household could ignore. The moment when a Tudor wife stopped enduring rarely arrived suddenly. It did not begin with raised voices in the great hall or dramatic confrontations before servants and relatives. Instead, the change usually appeared in quieter ways, forming slowly within the routine life of the household. For a long time, silence had served a purpose. Silence protected appearances. It preserved the dignity expected of a noblewoman and shielded the household from public embarrassment. As long as the marriage looked stable from the outside, the alliances built upon it remained secure. But silence had limits. There came a point when restraint no longer preserved stability. Instead, it began to invite doubt. At first, the signs were subtle. Guests might exchange glances during a gathering when the husband mentions a name too casually. A servant might hesitate before answering a question about a recent journey. Even the tone of conversation at dinner could begin to change, carrying the faint tension of something everyone sensed but no one wished to address. Reputation in Tudor society was delicate. A noble household depended on the belief that its internal order remained intact. When rumors suggested otherwise, the consequences reached far beyond private discomfort. Relatives worried about the dignity of the family name. Political allies considered whether the household remained reliable. The wife understood this better than most. Her role had always been to embody stability. Guests saw her calm presence beside her husband and assumed that the household functioned exactly as it should. That image carried weight. It reassured relatives, maintained alliances, and kept gossip from spreading too far. Yet the presence of a mistress could slowly erode that carefully maintained impression. What began as whispers among servants might eventually reach the ears of visiting relatives. Conversations at court could carry hints of curiosity that sounded polite but felt uncomfortable. The household, once admired for its order, might begin to attract attention for the wrong reasons. In such circumstances, silence changed its meaning. What had once appeared dignified could start to resemble weakness. Observers who once admired the wife's composure might begin to wonder whether she had lost control of her own household. For a noblewoman, that perception carried serious risks. Authority inside the estate depended heavily on reputation. Servants obeyed because they believed the structure of the household remained strong. Relatives supported alliances because they trusted the marriage to remain stable. When doubt entered that structure, loyalty could weaken. The wife recognized this danger. Her patience had never meant ignorance. She had observed the small patterns that revealed her husband's changing behavior. She had noticed the unexplained expenses, the late journeys, and the whispers passing through corridors. For a long time, endurance allowed her to gather knowledge without disturbing the balance of the household. But knowledge eventually demanded action. Imagine an evening gathering inside the manor hall. Candles glow along the walls, illuminating polished wooden tables and the careful arrangements of silver and glass. Guests speak politely, while servants move quietly between them. In the middle of the conversation, someone refers to the mistress by name. The moment is brief. Most people pretend not to notice the shift in atmosphere. Yet the tension becomes impossible to ignore. A name that once belonged only to private rumors has entered public conversation. For the wife, this moment carries unmistakable meaning. The problem is no longer hidden. What once existed quietly beyond the walls of the household has begun to threaten the dignity of the marriage itself. If such moments continue, the reputation of the entire family could suffer. A noble marriage was meant to represent strength. If that strength appeared compromised, rival families might interpret it as an opportunity. Political alliances could weaken. Even the loyalty of distant relatives might become uncertain. The wife understands that endurance alone cannot repair the damage once visibility has begun. Silence had preserved the illusion of harmony, but the illusion now shows cracks. And cracks, once visible, rarely disappear on their own. Inside her private chamber, the wife may sit quietly beside a writing table while the household settles into evening silence. The same routines continue as always. Servants extinguish candles, doors close softly, and the corridors grow still. Yet her thoughts move differently now. Patience has carried her far, but patience without action risks surrendering the authority she was meant to protect. The household expects her to preserve stability, and stability sometimes requires more than endurance. It requires a decision. The decision does not arrive with anger. It forms slowly, shaped by observation, calculation, and the recognition that the balance of the household must change if it is to survive. From that moment forward, the quiet endurance that defined her role begins to transform into something else. Something deliberate, something strategic, something capable of altering the structure that once seemed untouchable. The wife's silence had protected the dignity of her household for a long time, allowing her to observe the shifting patterns around her marriage. Yet once rumors began to circulate openly, silence no longer preserved the stability she was meant to defend. A quiet realization began to settle in her mind that the order of the household might only survive if someone chose to change it. Conflict inside a Tudor marriage rarely remained confined to the private space where it first appeared. What might begin as a quiet tension between husband and wife could slowly expand into something much larger, especially within households where marriage itself served as a pillar of property, alliances, and reputation. At first, the matter might feel deeply personal. A wife noticing subtle changes in her husband's behavior could experience the situation as a private disappointment rather than a political concern. A letter sealed in unfamiliar wax, a journey that lasted longer than expected, or a gift, leaving the household accounts without explanation, might seem like fragments of a personal story unfolding quietly inside the walls of the estate. Yet noble households were never isolated worlds. Every marriage among the Tudor elite connected two families whose interests extended beyond the couple themselves. Land, inheritance, and alliances formed a network that tied one household to many others. Because of this, a disturbance inside a marriage could eventually affect the relationships surrounding it. Gradually, the wife began to see the situation differently. What had once seemed like a personal injury slowly revealed its broader implications. If her husband's behavior weakened the dignity of the marriage, it also threatened the alliances that relied upon the appearance of stability. In Tudor society, appearances held remarkable power. Relatives expected the marriage to remain honourable because their own reputations were tied to it. Allies relied on the household's stability when negotiating property or political support. Even distant acquaintances judged the strength of a family, partly through the harmony they believed existed inside the marriage. Once that harmony appeared uncertain, confidence could weaken. Recognition of this larger risk often changed the way a wife approached the situation. Endurance alone might protect her personal dignity for a time, but it could not always preserve the political balance surrounding the household. Observation slowly began to evolve into planning. Within the manor lived a network of individuals whose loyalty shaped the atmosphere of the estate. Long-serving servants, distant, relative, clerics, and trusted advisors all formed part of a quiet structure of influence that surrounded the family. Each relationship carried a small but meaningful weight. Servants who respected the wife's authority often maintained loyalty through years of routine management. They trusted the stability she represented. Relatives from her own family might feel responsible for defending the dignity of a marriage they had helped arrange. Clerics, who viewed marriage as a sacred bond, could quietly support the preservation of lawful union. None of these connections required dramatic declarations. Support developed slowly, often through conversations that appeared entirely ordinary. A discussion about estate finances with the steward could quietly reinforce the wife's authority. A letter to a brother or cousin might express concern about the household's reputation without revealing the full story. Such gestures rarely attracted attention. Yet, over time, they created a subtle web of understanding. Inside this web, the wife's position remained stronger than many observers realized. Her authority rested not only on personal dignity, but also on institutions that reinforced lawful marriage. Church recognition, family alliances, and inheritance laws all strengthened her place within the structure of the household. A mistress rarely possessed those advantages. Her influence depended largely on the attention of one man. While that attention could grant her moments of visibility, it rarely provided lasting security. The moment that favor shifted, her position could weaken rapidly. The wife understood this difference. Her strength did not lie in sudden confrontation, but in the quiet reinforcement of structures already supporting her legitimacy. By strengthening those structures, she could gradually reshape the balance of influence within the household. Small changes sometimes signaled this shift. Servants might respond more carefully to the wife's instructions than to the husband's sudden requests. Relatives visiting the manor might spend more time speaking privately with her than with him. Conversations around the dinner table might begin to revolve around the preservation of family dignity. None of these adjustments appeared dramatic. Yet together they altered the atmosphere of the household. A situation that once seemed like a personal humiliation slowly transformed into a question of authority and stability. The conflict moved beyond the bedroom and entered the wider structure of the estate itself. Imagine a quiet evening in the manor's private chamber. A candle burns beside the writing table, while the corridors outside grow silent after the household has settled for the night. The wife sits with several letters before her. Some concern ordinary matters, harvest reports, repairs to a tenant's cottage, invitations from neighbouring estates. Others carry subtler meanings. A relative expressing concern about rumours. A trusted advisor asks whether the household remains well. Each message reminds her that the marriage connects to a larger world of expectations. Personal pain no longer stands alone. The stability of alliances, the reputation of families, and the future of the estate itself now form part of the same calculation. Endurance remains important, but endurance alone cannot protect everything that depends upon the marriage. Slowly, a different understanding emerges. Private conflict has become a matter of strategy. Careful observation turns into quiet preparation. Relationships are strengthened. Loyalties are reinforced. And the wife begins to consider how the balance of authority within the household might be restored. Such changes do not occur loudly. They unfold gradually, shaped by patience, intelligence, and the awareness that power within a Tudor household often moves through invisible channels long before anyone speaks about it openly. A personal conflict within the marriage slowly expanded into a question of stability for the entire household. Observation and patience began to transform private endurance into careful preparation. Somewhere within those quiet preparations, the first signs of a new balance of power were already beginning to appear. Careful attention to detail often became one of the quiet strengths of a Tudor wife. Life inside a large household produced an endless flow of small information. Receipts for supplies, letters arriving from distant towns, servants carrying messages between rooms, and travelers appearing unexpectedly at the gate. Most people treated these details as part of an ordinary routine. Yet, for someone who managed the household every day, routine itself became a map. Patterns of spending, communication, and movement rarely changed without reason. When something did change, it stood out against the steady rhythm of the estate. The wife had long been responsible for supervising the practical life of the manor. She knew how much grain should be purchased for winter, how much cloth was needed for servants' uniforms, and how frequently horses required new equipment. The ledgers that recorded these expenses passed through her hands regularly. At first glance, such records looked dull. Columns of numbers and notes written in careful handwriting rarely attracted attention from guests or visitors. Yet, those quiet pages contained a remarkable amount of information about the hidden life of the household. A payment made to an unfamiliar name could reveal a journey not mentioned at dinner. A repeated purchase of gifts might suggest an attachment that extended beyond ordinary courtesy. A servant sent frequently to the same town might indicate the location of someone the husband preferred to keep unseen. None of these details proved anything by themselves, but patterns rarely lied. When numbers repeated themselves across several weeks, or when letters arrived at unusual hours, the structure of the household began to reveal things that were never spoken aloud. Imagine a morning in the steward's office, where the estate accounts were kept. Sunlight enters through a narrow window and falls across a long wooden table covered with ledgers. The steward explains the week's expenses, while the wife listens calmly, occasionally asking a quiet question about a payment that appears slightly unusual. Her tone remains neutral. To the steward, the conversation sounds like ordinary management of the estate. Yet each answer adds another small piece of knowledge to the wife's understanding of the household. Information also travelled through a second network that rarely appeared in written records. Servants formed the invisible circulation system of the manor. They carried trays through corridors, delivered letters, saddled horses, and overheard conversations that others assumed were private. Because the wife supervised the servants directly, many of them felt a stronger loyalty to her than to anyone else in the household. Long service often created a bond of quiet trust. A maid who had worked in the house for 10 years might feel responsible for protecting its stability. A stable boy might speak casually about a journey that seemed unusual without realizing how important the information might become. These conversations rarely resembled interrogations. Instead, they occurred naturally while the daily life of the estate continued. A servant might mention that a horse had been prepared late at night. Another might remark that a visitor had waited outside the gate longer than expected. Each comment sounded ordinary, yet when combined with the records in the household ledgers, such remarks created a clearer picture of events that had once seemed vague. The wife rarely revealed the full extent of what she understood. Discretion remained essential in Tudor society. Open accusations could damage reputation and attract gossip that spreads quickly between estates. Knowledge was far more useful when it remained quiet. Over time, the scattered fragments of information began to form a coherent pattern. Expenses connected to the same destination, letters arriving with similar seals. Servants repeated small observations that pointed toward the same explanation. The presence of a mistress, once suspected only through intuition, slowly became supported by evidence. Yet the value of that evidence extended beyond simple confirmation. Information itself could become a form of influence. A secret carefully understood but not immediately revealed carried power. It allowed the wife to choose the moment when knowledge might shape a conversation with relatives, advisors, or clerics who valued the preservation of lawful marriage. In a world where reputation determined authority, the difference between rumour and proof mattered greatly. Rumours could be dismissed. Evidence could not. Picture a quiet evening in the wife's private chamber. The candle beside her writing table flickers as she reviews several letters and notes gathered during the past weeks. Outside the room, the household has settled into silence. The documents before her appear ordinary to anyone else. Yet together, they tell a story. Not a story of sudden drama, but a pattern of actions repeated often enough to reveal intention. A pattern that connects spending, travel, and communication in ways that leave little room for coincidence. The wife closes the final ledger slowly. Her expression remains calm. The information she holds does not demand immediate confrontation. Its strength lies in the fact that it exists at all. Knowledge gathered patiently over time rarely loses its value. Within the quiet structure of a Tudor household, secrets did not always remain hidden. Sometimes they simply waited to be used. Quiet observation of accounts, letters, and conversations gradually transformed scattered details into a clear understanding of the household's hidden patterns. What once appeared to be harmless routine began to reveal connections that could no longer be ignored. Within those carefully gathered secrets rested a kind of power that might one day alter the balance of the entire household. Isolation rarely began with a dramatic gesture inside a Tudor household. It did not start with public accusations or sudden confrontations that echoed through the great hall. Instead, it unfolded slowly, through a series of small changes that gradually altered the position of one person within the social structure of the estate. Once the wife understood the patterns surrounding the mistress, the situation no longer remained merely a private conflict. It became a question of balance within the household's network of influence. That network included relatives, servants, visitors, and the wider community that watched noble families with careful attention. The mistress might have enjoyed the attention of the husband, but her position depended heavily on that attention continuing. Unlike the legal wife, she did not stand inside the protective structures of marriage. The church did not recognize her place within the household, and the law offered her no claim to the estate. Her influence relied largely on proximity to the man who favored her. Because of this, her social position remained fragile. The wife understood that weakening that position rarely required open hostility. Instead, it required quiet adjustments to the environment surrounding the mistress. The first of these adjustments often appeared in the realm of reputation. In Tudor society, a woman's reputation shaped how others responded to her presence. Respectable women were welcomed into drawing rooms, invited to gatherings, and treated with a certain level of courtesy. Women whose reputations appeared uncertain found doors closing quietly around them. The wife rarely needed to speak openly about the mistress. Rumours could travel on their own, a remark shared during a visit with relatives, a cautious comment made in conversation with a trusted neighbour, or a question raised gently about the character of a certain acquaintance could encourage others to reconsider their attitudes. The effect was subtle but powerful. Gradually, invitations might stop arriving, conversations might grow cooler, polite smiles might carry a hint of distance. At the same time, financial channels could begin to narrow. Maintaining a visible relationship required resources, gifts, travel, clothing, and accommodations all required money. If the household accounts were already under the careful supervision of the wife, controlling the flow of funds could become another quiet method of influence. Expenses that once passed without question might now require explanation. Payments that appeared unnecessary might be delayed. Servants responsible for carrying gifts or letters might receive new instructions about how household resources were to be managed. None of these changes appeared dramatic, yet they slowly reduced the ease with which the husband could support the mistress openly. The third element of isolation is often developed through the shaping of trust. Within noble society, loyalty carried enormous value. Families and allies depended on one another to maintain stability and reputation. When doubts about someone's loyalty emerged, even quietly, those doubts could influence how others treated that person. The wife might never accuse the mistress directly. Instead, she allowed questions to circulate. Was the mistress truly devoted to the household, or was she merely benefiting from the husband's favor? Could someone who encouraged tension inside a marriage be trusted within a network of alliances built upon stability? Such questions rarely required clear answers. The mere possibility of disloyalty could be enough to change the attitudes of relatives and advisors who valued order above personal attachment. Imagine a gathering inside the manor during a late afternoon visit from neighboring families. Conversation flows politely as tea is served, and servants move quietly between chairs. The wife speaks calmly with her guests, maintaining the composed dignity expected of her role. At some point, the subject of a certain woman arises. The wife does not criticize her directly. Instead, she speaks in measured tones about the importance of loyalty within marriage and the responsibility noble households carry toward their families and communities. Her words appear general, yet everyone understands the implication. Over time, such conversations shape the atmosphere surrounding the mistress. Without open accusations, her presence begins to feel less welcome within the circles that once tolerated her. Isolation rarely arrives with a single, decisive moment. It grows gradually through small adjustments in reputation, resources, and trust. Each change alone appears harmless. Together, they create an environment in which the mistress finds fewer allies, fewer opportunities, and fewer ways to maintain influence. Inside the household, the balance of power begins to shift quietly. What once looked like a position supported by the husband's favor now appears increasingly uncertain. Attention alone cannot sustain a role when the wider network surrounding the household begins to withdraw its acceptance. And within that quiet withdrawal lies a strategy far more effective than open conflict. Quiet changes in reputation, finance, and trust slowly weakened the position of the mistress within the household's social network. What once seemed like a relationship supported by attention and gifts began to lose the wider support that allowed it to exist comfortably. Somewhere within that growing isolation, the mistress was beginning to realize that the household around her was no longer standing on her side. Reputation in Tudor society was not something that existed by accident. It was shaped gradually through behavior that others could observe, interpret, and repeat in conversation. Within a noble household, the wife understood that her public presence carried meaning far beyond personal dignity. Every appearance before neighbors, relatives, and church officials helped define how the household itself was perceived. Because of this, moments outside the manor walls often became as important as those within them. Church gatherings, community events, and visits with neighboring families provided opportunities for the wife to reinforce the image that society expected from her. These occasions rarely required grand gestures. Instead, they depended on consistency. A noble woman who appeared calm, attentive, and devoted to her responsibilities created a powerful impression. The church played a particularly important role in this process. In Tudor England, marriage was not simply a private contract. It was considered a sacred union recognized by religious authority. When a husband and wife attended church together, their presence symbolized a bond that the community believed should remain stable. The wife understood this symbolism well. Even when private tensions existed inside the marriage, she continued to appear regularly within the church community. Her conduct remained respectful and composed. She listened to sermons, spoke courteously with neighbors, and participated in the rituals that reinforced the moral structure of society. Such behavior rarely attracted dramatic attention, yet its quiet consistency carried influence. Clergy and parishioners alike valued the example of a noble household that appeared devoted to the ideals of lawful marriage. Each public appearance reinforced the impression that the wife remained committed to the responsibilities that accompanied her position. Her role as a mother also strengthened this image. Children represented the future of the household, and their upbringing reflected directly on the character of their parents. A wife who demonstrated visible care for her children reinforced the perception that she embodied stability and responsibility. Visitors to the estate might observe her, guiding the education of a son who would one day inherit the family lands. Others might see her supervising the daily routines of younger children, ensuring that their behavior reflected the dignity expected from a noble lineage. These moments carried symbolic weight. They reminded observers that the lawful wife represented continuity. Through her children, the family's future remained secure. The presence of heirs born within legitimate marriage reinforced the very structure that noble society depended upon. Gradually, a contrast began to form. On one side stood the wife, surrounded by the recognition of church, family, and community. Her conduct aligned with the expectations of lawful marriage. Her children represented the continuation of the household's name. On the other side existed the mistress. Even if she appeared charming or admired in certain private circles, her position remained outside the boundaries of legitimacy. She possessed no recognized place within the church's understanding of marriage. Her presence could not be publicly celebrated without raising uncomfortable questions. This difference rarely required direct explanation. The contrast spoke for itself. Imagine a Sunday morning when members of the local community gather inside a stone church. The air carries the murmur of conversation before the service begins. Sunlight filters through narrow windows, illuminating rows of wooden benches. The wife enters with her children beside her. Her presence appears entirely natural. She greets familiar faces with polite warmth and takes her place among families who have known her for years. Nothing about the scene feels unusual, yet the symbolism is unmistakable. She represents the lawful structure of family life that the church exists to support. Her calm presence reassures the community that the household continues to stand within that structure. The mistress, by contrast, cannot easily share that space. Her relationship with her husband remains undefined in the language of law and religion. Even if she appears within the same social circles, the legitimacy surrounding the wife creates an invisible boundary between them. Over time, that boundary becomes increasingly important. Reputation in Tudor society depended on such distinctions. People trusted what they could recognize as lawful and stable. They supported the relationships that aligned with the moral framework reinforced by the church and tradition. The wife did not need to attack her rival directly. By simply embodying the expectations of her role, she strengthened the contrast that already existed between them. Each appearance in church, each moment of devotion to her children, and each display of calm responsibility quietly reinforced her authority. Within that contrast lay a powerful message. One woman stood firmly within the order recognized by society. The other remained outside it. And in a world where legitimacy determined loyalty, that difference could reshape the balance of power more effectively than any open confrontation. Through steady appearances before church and community, the wife reinforced the image of lawful responsibility that society trusted. Her devotion to her children and household gradually strengthened the contrast between legitimacy and secrecy. Within that growing contrast, the quiet authority surrounding the wife began to eclipse the fragile position of the woman who stood outside the law. Realization rarely arrived suddenly for a mistress in a Tudor household. It did not appear as a single dramatic moment where everything changed at once. Instead, it emerged gradually, through small signals that slowly altered how the world around her responded. At first, the changes might seem almost imaginary. The same corridors remained familiar. The same servants moved through the household, and the same rooms still carried the warmth of candlelight during evening gatherings. From the outside, the rhythm of life appeared unchanged, yet something subtle had shifted. A mistress who once moved through the household with quiet confidence might begin to notice small differences in the behavior of others. Conversations that once welcomed her presence now paused when she entered the room. Servants who once responded quickly to her requests began to answer with cautious politeness rather than eager attention. Such changes were easy to overlook at first, but patterns slowly revealed themselves. The husband who once sent frequent letters might now respond less often. Gifts that had once arrived regularly might become rare. Invitations to accompany him on journeys or visits might be postponed with vague explanations. None of these gestures openly announced the end of favour, yet together they suggested something important. Favour in Tudor society rarely disappeared with a formal declaration. It faded quietly, leaving behind a space where uncertainty slowly replaced confidence. The mistress depended heavily on the attention of the man who supported her. Unlike the wife, she possessed no formal recognition within the structure of the household. The church did not acknowledge her role, and the law offered her no claim to property or inheritance. Her security rested largely on the continuation of personal affection. When that affection weakened, the fragility of her position became impossible to ignore. At the same time, changes could begin to appear beyond the household itself. Families in Tudor society watched one another closely. Alliances between households relied on the stability of marriage and reputation. When rumours circulated about tensions within a noble household, relatives and acquaintances adjusted their behaviour carefully. A family connected to the mistress might begin to reconsider its involvement. At first, the distance might appear subtle. Letters that once carried warmth might become shorter and more formal. Invitations might arrive less frequently. Conversations that once encouraged her presence might turn cautious. The reason for this distance was rarely stated openly. Associating too closely with a mistress could carry risks if the household's balance of power began to change. Families who valued their own reputation preferred to avoid situations that might draw them into conflict. Gradually, the network that once supported the mistress grew thinner. Imagine a quiet afternoon visit to a neighbouring estate. The mistress arrives, expecting the same hospitality she had received many times before. Servants greet her politely. Yet the warmth of earlier visits seems absent. The host speaks with careful courtesy, but avoids certain subjects. The conversation remains pleasant, yet something unspoken lingers beneath the surface. The mistress senses it. The atmosphere has changed. Inside the household itself, the shift becomes even clearer. Servants, who once carried messages on her behalf, may now hesitate before agreeing. Requests that once passed easily through the structure of the estate might encounter small delays. The invisible network of assistance that once surrounded her no longer responds with the same enthusiasm. Such changes rarely occur by accident. They reflect a growing awareness among those who live and work within the household. Servants observe where authority truly lies, and they adjust their loyalties accordingly. If the wife's influence grows stronger while the husband's attention weakens, the servants understand that supporting the mistress may no longer serve their own interests. Isolation begins to take shape through these small decisions. The mistress may still appear within the household, yet the quiet support that once surrounded her has begun to dissolve. Doors open less easily. Conversations grow shorter. Invitations arrive less often. The change becomes visible not through confrontation but through absence. What once felt like a secure place within the household now feels uncertain. The mistress realizes that attention alone cannot sustain her position when the wider structure of the household begins to withdraw its acceptance. Protection fades in stages. First comes uncertainty, then distance, and finally a growing awareness that the network which once supported her presence has begun to disappear. Within the quiet halls of the manor, this realization carries profound consequences, because in Tudor society, losing protection often meant losing everything that depended upon it. The mistress slowly begins to understand that the favour sustaining her position is no longer as strong as it once seemed. At the same time, the families and allies who once welcomed her presence begin to step back with quiet caution. Soon, the growing distance around her starts to reveal a truth she can no longer ignore. Pressure in a Tudor household rarely appeared through confrontation. Influence moved more quietly, often through the gradual exposure of weaknesses that had once been hidden behind the authority of the husband. A nobleman might appear confident in his position. His name stood on property documents. His voice carried weight among servants, and his presence represented the outward power of the household. Yet even a man who seemed firmly in control could possess vulnerabilities that others eventually noticed. One of the most visible weaknesses often appears in the management of money. Maintaining an estate in Tudor England required careful balance. Farms had to produce enough grain to sustain tenants and servants. Repairs to buildings demanded regular expense. Payments to workers, craftsmen, and suppliers filled the ledgers that recorded the life of the household. When those accounts remained stable, the household appeared prosperous and well managed. But irregular spending could quickly attract attention. A husband who devoted resources to a mistress often did so through gifts, travel, and accommodations that did not appear openly in household plans. Jewelry, clothing, and private lodging required funds that might not easily fit within the normal patterns of estate management. Over time, such expenses left traces. The wife, already accustomed to reviewing household accounts, you could notice these changes long before others spoke about them openly. A sudden increase in withdrawals, an unexplained payment to a merchant in another town, or repeated purchases that served no clear purpose inside the manor might all signal something unusual. At first, these differences might appear small, yet repeated patterns carried meaning. Once the irregular spending became visible, it created an opportunity to reshape how others viewed the husband's behavior. Noble families valued responsibility in financial matters because the prosperity of an estate affected everyone connected to it. If the husband appeared careless with money, his judgment could be questioned. Such concerns rarely required loud accusations. Relatives from both sides of the marriage often paid attention to the stability of the household. A father who had arranged the marriage might ask polite questions about the condition of the estate. Brothers or uncles might express curiosity about certain expenses that seemed unusually large. These conversations rarely sounded hostile. They often appeared as expressions of concern. Yet concern could carry weight. A husband who sensed that relatives were watching his decisions more closely might begin to feel pressure that did not exist before. His authority inside the household remained intact, but the confidence surrounding that authority could begin to weaken. Reputation played an equally important role. In Tudor society, a nobleman's honor depended heavily on how others perceived his conduct. Financial recklessness could damage that perception, especially if rumors suggested that the spending served private indulgence rather than the welfare of the estate. Neighbors might begin to question whether the household remained well governed. Allies might hesitate before entering into agreements with a man whose judgment appeared uncertain. The wife rarely needed to describe the situation directly. Instead, she could allow facts to speak for themselves. Imagine a gathering where relatives discuss the future of the estate. Ledgers lie open on a table, while candles illuminate columns of numbers written carefully across the pages. Someone points out that certain expenses have increased significantly in recent months. No accusation follows immediately, yet the implication hangs quietly in the air. The husband recognizes that others have begun to notice what once remained private. The gifts, the travel, and the hidden costs of maintaining a relationship outside the marriage now appear connected to the stability of the household itself. Pressure grows through such moments. Family members who once ignored the situation may now speak cautiously about the importance of preserving the family's reputation. Clerics might remind the household of moral responsibilities tied to lawful marriage. Advisors concerned with the estate's prosperity might recommend greater discipline in financial matters. None of these voices demands immediate confrontation, but together they form a quiet circle of expectation. The husband, once able to act without explanation, now senses that his choices carry wider consequences. Each expense, each journey, and each rumor becomes part of a larger conversation about responsibility and honor. For a nobleman whose authority depends on respect, the possibility of losing that respect can become deeply uncomfortable. The wife understands this dynamic well. Her influence does not require open conflict. By allowing financial patterns and concerns about reputation to emerge gradually, she shifts the focus from personal rivalry to the stability of the household itself. What once appeared to be a private matter between husband and wife becomes a question of leadership. And in Tudor society, leadership always invited scrutiny. Irregular spending and growing concern among relatives slowly exposed the weaknesses behind the husband's confident authority. What once appeared to be a private indulgence began to look like a threat to the stability and reputation of the estate. Gradually, the pressure surrounding those weaknesses started to raise a question no one in the household could ignore any longer. Law in Tudor England did not exist only in distant courts or royal decrees. It lived quietly inside the everyday structures that governed marriage. Property and inheritance, documents stored in chests, seals pressed into wax, and signatures written on parchment all carried authority, capable of shaping the fate of a household. When conflict within a marriage reached a certain point, that authority could become a powerful instrument. For a long time, the wife might have relied on patience, reputation, and quiet alliances to stabilize the situation surrounding her household. Yet, there were moments when social pressure alone could not resolve the imbalance created by the husband's behavior. At that stage, the law offered another path. Unlike personal arguments or whispered rumors, legal claims carried formal weight. They required evidence, witnesses, and official acknowledgement. Once such claims entered the realm of legal scrutiny, the matter no longer belonged solely to the private life of the marriage. It became a question of rights and responsibilities. In Tudor society, accusations related to marital conduct were often handled through ecclesiastical courts connected to the church. These courts oversaw matters involving marriage vows, moral behavior, and disputes that affected the legitimacy of family life. A wife seeking protection within this system did not always begin by openly accusing her husband of betrayal. Instead, the situation could unfold through a series of careful steps. Evidence gathered quietly over time. Letters, financial records, and testimony from servants could begin to form a narrative that questioned the husband's conduct. These details might reveal patterns that suggest neglect of marital obligations or misuse of household resources. Individually, such details appeared ordinary. Together, they could raise serious concerns. The wife understood that presenting such information required caution. Tudor society valued the preservation of reputation, and reckless accusations could damage the dignity of everyone involved. For this reason, legal action often began with formal inquiries rather than direct condemnation. Clerics or advisors might review the circumstances surrounding the household. Questions could be raised about the management of property or the behavior expected within a lawful marriage. Witnesses who had observed unusual events might be asked to describe what they had seen. Each step introduced greater attention to the matter. Gradually, the husband's private actions became subjects of official conversation. What once existed as rumor now appeared within documents and testimonies that demanded careful examination. Property law added another dimension to the situation. Marriage in Tudor England tied together not only two individuals, but also the wealth and lands associated with their families. When questions about marital conduct emerged, those questions sometimes intersected with concerns about inheritance and control of resources. If the husband's behavior appeared reckless or damaging to the estate, relatives from both sides of the marriage might express interest in protecting the household's long-term stability. Discussions about property management could therefore become connected to broader concerns about the husband's judgment. In this way, legal frameworks created pressure without requiring open conflict. Imagine a chamber where advisors and clerics gather around a heavy wooden table. Papers lie before them, illuminated by candlelight. The documents record financial transactions, letters exchanged between distant towns, and statements from individuals who have observed the household's recent changes. No raised voices fill the room. Instead, careful questions guide the discussion. Does the husband continue to fulfill the obligations expected within a lawful marriage? Are the resources of the estate being used responsibly? Do the circumstances suggest a pattern that threatens the dignity of the household? Each question draws attention to the same underlying concern. The husband may still command authority within the manor walls. Yet outside those walls, a different process has begun. Legal structures exist precisely to examine situations where private conduct affects public stability. Once the matter enters that framework, it becomes difficult to dismiss. Reputation, property, and responsibility now intersect in ways that place the husband under increasing scrutiny. His actions no longer appear as isolated choices, but as behaviors that may influence the future of the entire estate. For the wife, this shift represents an important transformation. What once seemed like a personal struggle within her marriage has become a matter addressed through institutions designed to preserve order. The conflict moves beyond emotion and enters a system governed by evidence and procedure and judgment. Inside that system, authority operates differently. It does not rely on the loudest voice or the strongest temper. It relies on proof. And proof, once assembled patiently, can reshape the balance of power within a household more effectively than any private argument. Legal structures began to transform the husband's private behavior into a matter examined through evidence and responsibility. What once existed as rumor within the household slowly entered a framework of inquiry guided by law and reputation. In time, the question of marital conduct began to carry consequences that reached far beyond the private life of the couple. Religion occupied a central place in the structure of Tudor society. Church bells marked the rhythm of each week. Sermons shaped moral expectations. And the authority of clergy reached into the most intimate aspects of family life. Marriage itself was not considered merely a social arrangement or legal contract. It was understood as a sacred bond that carried obligations recognized by both God and community. For this reason, the church held quiet influence over the stability of noble households. A wife seeking to protect her position within a troubled marriage often understood the importance of this influence. Legal inquiries might examine property and conduct, but moral authority carried a different kind of weight. It shaped how neighbors interpreted behavior and how families judged responsibility. The language of duty, when spoken through religious authority, could reach places that ordinary arguments could not. Within Tudor belief, a husband and wife were expected to uphold their vows before God. Sermons frequently reminded parishioners that marriage required fidelity, restraint, and mutual responsibility. A noble household that appeared to neglect those duties risked more than gossip. It risked moral scrutiny. The wife did not need to accuse her husband directly in order to bring attention to these expectations. Public devotion itself could create a powerful contrast. Regular church attendance reinforced her reputation as a woman who respected the sacred obligations of marriage. Her presence during services, her respectful conversations with clergy, and her visible participation in religious life strengthened the perception that she fulfilled the duties expected of her. In Tudor society, such behavior rarely passed unnoticed. Clergy often served as advisors to families navigating personal difficulties. A priest who observed the household regularly might sense the tension surrounding the marriage without needing explicit explanation. Gentle conversations about the importance of fidelity and responsibility could naturally arise during visits or confessions. These conversations rarely sounded like accusations. Instead, they resembled reminders of principles that everyone in the community was expected to respect. The effect of those reminders could be significant. A husband who once treated the situation as a private matter might begin to feel pressure from the wider moral framework surrounding him. The church did not enforce its influence through dramatic punishments in everyday situations, yet its authority shaped the reputation of individuals within the community. If whispers began suggesting that a nobleman had neglected his marital obligations, those whispers could affect how others regarded him. Allies might question his judgment. Clerics might offer advice that carried subtle criticism. Neighbors might speak cautiously about the importance of preserving lawful marriage. Each comment appeared mild on its own. Together, they created an atmosphere in which the husband could no longer treat his behavior as something entirely private. Imagine a quiet Sunday morning inside a stone parish church. Sunlight filters through narrow windows, while members of the local community gather along wooden benches. The air holds the murmur of greetings before the service begins. The wife sits among the congregation with calm composure. Her children remain beside her, their presence reinforcing the image of a lawful household built upon family and continuity. When the priest begins speaking about the responsibilities of marriage, the message resonates within a setting that everyone understands. Marriage requires loyalty. Marriage requires discipline. Marriage requires respect for the promises spoken before God. The sermon does not name anyone directly, yet those listening understand that such words carry relevance beyond abstract teaching. For the husband, moments like this can become uncomfortable. The expectations expressed by the church echo through the social world surrounding him. Relatives who value religious order may repeat similar sentiments in conversation. Friends who share the same moral framework may offer advice that gently suggests restraint. Pressure grows without any dramatic confrontation. The wife benefits from this process precisely because she does not need to demand it openly. Her steady presence within the church community reinforces the perception that she stands firmly within the moral order that society respects. That perception creates legitimacy. When conflict within the marriage eventually becomes more visible, observers are already inclined to view the situation through the lens of duty and responsibility. The wife appears aligned with those principles. The husband, by contrast, may appear to have drifted away from them. Such differences influence how people interpret events. Authority in Tudor society depended not only on wealth or legal rights, but also on the belief that an individual respected the moral structure guiding the community. A person perceived as acting against that structure risked losing support in subtle but meaningful ways. Through patience and visible devotion, the wife gradually strengthens the ground beneath her position. She does not attack her husband directly. Instead, she allows the expectations of religion and tradition to frame the situation in a way that quietly favors her. And within that moral framework, the balance of sympathy and authority slowly begins to shift. Religious expectation and public devotion quietly reinforce the wife's position within the moral structure of Tudor society. Reminders of marital duty began to surround the household through sermons, conversations, and the watchful presence of the community. Before long, the husband faced a growing pressure, shaped not by confrontation, but by the moral authority he could no longer easily ignore. Changes inside a Tudor household rarely appeared all at once. Authority that once seemed firm often weakened gradually. Through small shifts in attention, loyalty, and reputation, what had once looked like a stable structure of influence could begin to tilt quietly without anyone announcing that a transformation had begun. At first, the alteration could be felt in the husband's behavior. For a long time, his favor had sustained the presence of the mistress. His decisions determined who received gifts, who enjoyed invitations to travel, and who occupied a visible place within the life of the household. Attention from the master of the estate carried meaning, and those around him often adjusted their behavior accordingly. Yet attention could also change. A husband who once seemed confident in his authority might begin to feel the weight of the pressures gathering around him. Conversations with relatives about estate finances, reminders from clergy about marital responsibility, and quiet observations from advisors about reputation could slowly influence his actions. None of these pressures demanded an immediate response, but together they altered the atmosphere surrounding his choices. Where he once acted freely, he now sensed that others were watching. Decisions that once passed unnoticed now carried the possibility of judgment. A gift sent too openly, or a journey taken too frequently, might provoke questions that he preferred to avoid. Gradually, the attention he once gave to the mistress began to weaken. Letters that had arrived frequently became less common. Visits that once occurred regularly grew uncertain. Invitations that once seemed effortless required more explanation than before. The mistress could feel this change before anyone spoke about it openly. Favor, after all, had always been the foundation of her position. Without that favor, the gestures that sustained her presence began to disappear. What once seemed secure now felt fragile. At the same time, the husband himself did not escape scrutiny. The quiet inquiries surrounding his financial decisions and personal conduct had already begun to influence how others regarded him. Relatives who once trusted his leadership might now observe him with cautious curiosity. Advisors responsible for protecting the estate's prosperity might begin to question whether his judgment remained steady. Such doubts rarely appeared in direct accusations. Instead, they surfaced in subtle ways. A conversation during dinner might turn toward the importance of responsibility in managing family wealth. A visiting uncle might remark on the value of preserving the dignity of marriage. Even casual remarks about reputation could carry an undertone that pointed toward the husband's recent choices. These moments created a new tension inside the household. For the first time, both the husband and the mistress found themselves facing uncertainty. The husband sensed that his authority no longer moved without scrutiny. The mistress sensed that the protection she once relied upon had begun to weaken. Their positions, once connected by mutual advantage, now appeared vulnerable. Meanwhile, the wife's position remained steady. Her conduct had not changed dramatically. She continued to manage the household with the same composed attention she had always displayed. Her presence at church remained regular. Her care for the children continued to reinforce the image of lawful stability. Yet the perception surrounding her had begun to shift. Where some observers once interpreted her silence as resignation, they now recognized it as restraint. Where others once assumed she lacked influence, they now saw that the structures of family, law, and morality quietly supported her. This difference gradually altered the balance of sympathy within the household. Servants who watched the unfolding situation often aligned themselves with stability. Advisors who valued the estate's reputation preferred the authority that preserved order. Relatives who had helped arrange the marriage felt inclined to protect the dignity of the family. In such an environment, the positions of both the husband and the mistress became less secure. Imagine an evening in the manor hall where guests gather for a modest supper. Conversation flows politely, yet the atmosphere carries a subtle tension that did not exist before. The husband speaks with confidence, though his words seem measured. The mistress's name arises briefly in conversation, then fades again without enthusiasm. The wife sits quietly among the guests. Her calm presence does not demand attention. Yet many eyes turn toward her when the subject of family stability arises. In that moment, the contrast between legitimacy and uncertainty becomes unmistakable. Power within the household has not changed through open confrontation. Instead, it has shifted through perception. The mistress no longer stands surrounded by unquestioned favor. The husband no longer commands influence without scrutiny. Both discover that the ground beneath their authority has grown less stable than before. The favor that once protected the mistress has begun to fade, leaving her position increasingly uncertain. At the same time, the husband finds his decisions examined more closely by relatives, advisors, and the wider community. Slowly, the quiet balance of the household begins to move in a direction neither of them fully expected. Influence in Tudor society rarely depended on a single individual acting alone. Power moved through networks of relationships that extended far beyond the walls of any single household. Noblemen relied on relatives, advisors, and allies who supported their decisions at court and within the political life of the realm. Without those connections, authority could weaken quickly. A husband who appeared strong inside his manor often depended heavily on the confidence others placed in him. Fellow nobles supported his position in discussions at court. Trusted advisors helped him manage disputes involving property and alliances. Even distant acquaintances contributed to the quiet system of reputation that sustained his standing. Once doubts began to surround a man's conduct, those connections could start to loosen. The change rarely appeared dramatic. Instead, it unfolded through subtle adjustments in behavior. A conversation that once carried enthusiasm might become more cautious. Invitations to gatherings might arrive less frequently. Allies who once spoke confidently in support of a man's judgment might now choose their words more carefully. At first, the husband might not recognize the significance of these shifts. Life at court involved constant movement of influence and attention. Alliances changed frequently as families pursued their own interests. A single absence from a gathering or a delayed letter from a friend might appear insignificant. Yet patterns eventually revealed themselves. Relatives who had once praised his decisions might begin to emphasize the importance of stability within a household. Advisors who had once defended his authority might suggest more careful management of personal affairs. Conversations that once celebrated his confidence might now circle questions of prudence and responsibility. Such comments carried quiet implications. They suggested that the husband's recent behavior had attracted attention beyond the walls of his estate. In Tudor England, reputation travelled quickly among the circles of nobility. Courtiers exchanged observations during visits and banquets, often presenting their concerns as polite conversation rather than open criticism. Through these discussions, impressions of a man's character gradually formed. A nobleman known for sound judgment attracted respect. A nobleman whose decisions appeared careless risked losing support. The wife rarely needed to speak openly for these impressions to spread. Once the patterns surrounding the husband's conduct became visible, others began to draw their own conclusions. Imagine a gathering within the chambers of a noble residence near the royal court. Several men stand beside a long table, discussing matters of property and alliances. One of them mentions the husband's name while considering whether he should be involved in a particular negotiation. The response is polite but uncertain. Another advisor remarks that the stability of a household often reflects the stability of the man who governs it. A third suggests that certain matters might be better handled by someone whose reputation appears less complicated at the moment. No one speaks directly against the husband. Yet the hesitation reveals a growing lack of confidence. At the same time, the husband's closest advisors might begin to distance themselves from the situation. Advisors in Tudor society valued their own reputations carefully. Associating too closely with a man whose conduct attracted criticism could harm their own standing. As a result, some advisors might reduce their involvement in his affairs. Meetings that once occurred regularly might become infrequent. Letters that once offered strategic advice might become shorter and more cautious. Conversations that once carried enthusiasm might shift toward neutral topics. Gradually, the husband finds himself navigating decisions without the same level of guidance he once enjoyed. The effect of this isolation can be subtle but significant. Without trusted advisors reinforcing his authority, the husband must rely more heavily on his own judgment. Yet the very concerns that caused advisors to withdraw also weaken confidence in that judgment. The political network that once supported him begins to thin. Inside the household, this change becomes noticeable through small signals. Messages from the court arrive less often. Invitations to gatherings among influential families grow rare. Visitors who once sought the husband's opinion now appear only occasionally. Each absence carries meaning. Influence in Tudor society depended heavily on presence within these networks. When that presence diminished, authority diminished with it. The wife observes these changes. She understands that power rarely collapses in a single moment. Instead, it erodes through the quiet withdrawal of confidence from those who once sustained it. By allowing the husband's own actions to shape how others perceive him, she reinforces a process already underway. The household's stability increasingly appears to rest in the hands of the person who has preserved order rather than disrupted it. And in that contrast, the direction of influence begins to change. Support that once surrounded the husband within political circles has begun to weaken, as doubts about his judgment spread quietly. Allies and advisors grow cautious, choosing distance over association with a reputation that now attracts scrutiny. As those connections fade, the husband finds himself standing in a position far less secure than he once believed. Family alliances formed the backbone of noble life in Tudor England. Marriage connected two houses, but blood ties that existed before the wedding never disappeared. Parents, siblings, cousins, and uncles remained part of a network that continued to influence the fortunes of a woman long after she entered her husband's household. For a wife facing uncertainty inside her marriage, those connections could become essential. A noblewoman rarely stood entirely alone. The family that arranged her marriage retained a quiet interest in her position and reputation. Their involvement had originally helped secure the alliance between households, and their support could still shape how events unfolded if the marriage began to weaken. At first, communication between the wife and her family might remain subtle. Letters travelled regularly between estates in Tudor society, often discussing ordinary matters such as harvest yields, travel plans, or invitations to gatherings. Within these exchanges, however, a careful writer could convey deeper concerns without stating them openly. A phrase expressing worry about household stability might signal that circumstances had changed. A question about financial arrangements might invite advice that carried broader implications. Such letters rarely contained direct accusations. Instead, they created an understanding that the situation deserved attention from those who had once helped arrange the marriage. Gradually, relatives might respond with interest. A brother might visit the estate under the pretext of discussing property matters. An uncle, experienced in legal affairs, might offer guidance about protecting certain rights connected to the marriage settlement. A father might inquire about the management of land or the security of his daughter's future. Each visit appeared courteous, yet together they strengthened the presence of the wife's family within the situation. Financial independence formed one of the most important concerns in these discussions. Marriage agreements among the Tudor nobility often included provisions designed to protect a wife's security. Dowries, jointures, and settlements established rights that ensured a woman would not be left entirely dependent on her husband's decisions. If tensions within the marriage increased, understanding those provisions became crucial. Relatives familiar with the original marriage contract might review the documents carefully. They examined which lands or incomes had been promised to support the wife and her children. They considered whether those resources remained secure or required additional protection. Such discussions rarely attracted public attention, yet they quietly strengthened the wife's position. Financial independence meant that the wife could maintain dignity and stability, even if the household's internal balance shifted. It reduced the risk that she might be forced to tolerate situations that threatened her reputation or security. Legal support also played an important role. Members of the wife's family often possessed connections with advisors experienced in Tudor law. These advisors understood the complex rules governing inheritance, property, and marital obligations. Their knowledge allowed them to evaluate how the situation within the household might affect the wife's rights. Careful guidance from such figures helped prepare for possible outcomes. If the husband's conduct continued to attract scrutiny, legal options might become relevant. Property rights could be clarified. Financial arrangements could be reinforced. The wife's claim to certain resources could be secured in ways that limited the husband's control. Preparation did not mean immediate conflict. Instead, it created a foundation that allowed the wife to respond calmly to whatever developments followed. Imagine a quiet meeting inside a private chamber, where several members of the wife's family sit beside a heavy wooden table covered with documents. The marriage contract lies open before them, its language written in careful legal phrases. A relative traces a line across the parchment, pointing out provisions that guarantee the wife certain protections. Another advisor discusses how those provisions could be interpreted if circumstances within the household changed further. The conversation remains measured, No one speaks loudly or expresses anger. Yet the tone of the discussion reveals something important. The family is preparing to protect its own. Through these quiet alliances, the wife gains a different kind of strength. Her position no longer depends entirely on the behavior of her husband or the fragile favor surrounding the mistress. Instead, it rests upon a network of relatives, legal knowledge, and financial arrangements designed to preserve her standing. Power inside the household begins to shift through preparation rather than confrontation. The husband may still believe that his authority remains unquestioned. The mistress may still hope that favor will return to its former strength. But beyond their awareness, a new alignment is forming. Family loyalty, legal understanding, and financial security are gradually assembling around the wife. And once such a foundation exists, the possibility of a larger change within the household becomes much more real. Support from the wife's own family begins to reinforce her position through financial protection and legal preparation. Quiet conversations among relatives and advisors create a network capable of defending her rights and reputation. As these alliances strengthen, the household moves closer to a moment when its balance of power may shift decisively. Removal from public view rarely happened through open confrontation in Tudor society. A woman connected to a scandal was not always expelled dramatically or publicly condemned. More often, she simply began to disappear from the places where influence and visibility once sustained her presence. Public space mattered greatly within noble life. Court gatherings, formal dinners, church appearances, and visits between households all served as stages where reputation was quietly measured. A person seen regularly within these spaces appeared accepted. A person who vanished from them gradually lost the influence that visibility provided. For a mistress, whose position depended on favor and attention, presence within such spaces could be essential. As long as she appeared beside the husband at certain gatherings, or was known to accompany him during visits to court, her place in the social landscape retained a kind of fragile legitimacy. People might not approve openly, but they recognized that she existed within the orbit of his authority. Once that visibility began to fade, her position weakened quickly. The process rarely required a direct command. Instead, invitations began to change. A gathering at court might be arranged, where her presence was simply not requested. A dinner at a neighboring estate might include the husband and other members of the household. Yet the mistress might remain unmentioned in the invitation. Travel plans that once included her might suddenly require discretion. At first, such absences might appear accidental, yet repeated exclusions soon revealed a pattern. Gradually, the mistress found herself removed from the environments where she had once been seen and recognized. Without those appearances, her connection to the household grew less visible to the wider world. At the same time, another solution sometimes appeared within noble society. Marriage could serve as a quiet way to relocate someone whose presence had become inconvenient. A woman connected to controversy might suddenly receive an offer from a distant suitor whose circumstances encouraged acceptance. Such arrangements rarely occurred by chance. Families understood that marriage could redirect attention and remove tension from a troubled household. A union, arranged with someone living far from the center of court life, could provide the mistress with a respectable future, while also resolving the immediate problem. The woman might receive encouragement to accept the proposal. Friends might speak gently about the advantages of a stable household in the countryside. Relatives might remind her that marriage offered security and dignity. Advisors might suggest that the opportunity should not be ignored. None of these conversations sounded like commands. Yet together they formed a clear message. The path once available to her inside the original household had quietly closed. Imagine a late afternoon in the manor garden, where the mistress walks beneath the fading light. The familiar paths still wind between stone walls and carefully trimmed hedges. From a distance, the house appears unchanged. Yet the rhythm of the household around her has shifted. Servants no longer greet her with the same warmth. Invitations to accompany the husband on journeys no longer arrive. Conversations among visitors seem to pause when she approaches. Soon, a letter arrives carrying news of a possible marriage. The proposal appears respectful and practical. The suitor owns land in a distant county, far removed from the center of political life, where the household's tensions once unfolded. Accepting the offer promises stability. Refusing it promises uncertainty. In Tudor society, such decisions often carried an unspoken understanding. Marriage could transform a difficult situation into a respectable transition. A woman who left the household as a bride rather than a scandal preserved her dignity while allowing others to restore order. Distance completed the process. Once relocated to another estate or a rural household, the mistress gradually disappeared from the social circles where her presence had once created tension. News about her might arrive occasionally through letters or travelers. Yet those updates no longer influenced the life of the original household. The removal had been accomplished without public humiliation. No accusations filled the halls of the manor. No dramatic confrontation forced the situation to a visible conclusion. Instead, the mistress had simply moved away from the spaces where her presence once carried influence. Within the household, the effect became noticeable. Without her appearing at gatherings or accompanying her husband in public, the rumors surrounding the marriage slowly lost their immediate focus. Visitors who once whispered about scandal began speaking again about ordinary matters. The social landscape returned to something resembling stability. And in Tudor society, the disappearance of a problem often proved more effective than a direct attack against it. Gradual exclusion from court gatherings and social visits slowly removed the mistress from the public spaces where her influence once depended. A convenient marriage and distance from the household offered a quiet path away from the center of attention. Without confrontation or scandal, the woman who once disturbed the household's balance simply faded from the world that had once sustained her place. Authority in a Tudor household often appeared unshakable from the outside. The master of the estate signed documents, directed servants, and represented the family in dealings with neighbors and the royal court. His position gave the impression that every decision within the household flowed naturally through his will. Yet authority could weaken long before anyone spoke of its decline. For a long time, the husband may have believed that the structure of his power remained intact. The estate still bore his name. Servants still bowed when he entered a room. Letters addressed to the household still recognized him as its head. But beneath these outward signs, subtle changes had already begun to appear. Financial records, once handled casually through trusted stewards, now attracted closer attention. Relatives from the wife's side occasionally requested clarification about certain expenditures connected to the estate. Conversations about property management became more detailed than before. None of these requests sounded confrontational. They appeared practical. Yet they quietly introduced a new reality. The husband's decisions were no longer accepted without question. At first, he might dismiss such inquiries as ordinary curiosity. Noble families frequently discussed financial matters among themselves. Estates required careful management, and relatives often shared advice about improving revenue or protecting property. But repetition gradually changed the tone. Questions about specific payments appeared more frequently. Discussions about the allocation of land or income began to involve additional voices. Documents that once required only his approval now passed through the hands of advisors and family representatives. The husband gradually realized that something had shifted. The estate remained his in name, yet control no longer felt as absolute as it once had. This change did not happen through a single dramatic moment. Instead, it unfolded through a series of small adjustments that accumulated over time. One afternoon, he might notice that a steward consulted another advisor before completing a financial transaction. On another day, he might discover that relatives had already reviewed certain documents before presenting them to him. Each incident seemed minor, but together they suggested that oversight had begun to surround his authority. At the same time, the tone of conversations within the household subtly transformed. Servants who once carried out instructions without hesitation now occasionally sought confirmation from other members of the family. Advisors who once accepted his plans immediately now propose alternative approaches more openly. Such responses did not directly challenge his position, yet they revealed that others felt increasingly confident, questioning his judgment. Imagine the husband seated at a long wooden table in the estate's study. Papers lie spread before him, records of land rents, correspondence from neighbouring families, and reports concerning the household's finances. He notices that several annotations appear beside certain figures. These notes are written in another hand. Perhaps a relative has reviewed the accounts before they reached him. Perhaps an advisor has marked sections that deserve further explanation. The details themselves may be small, but the presence of these observations carries an unmistakable message. Someone else is watching. The realization may come slowly. For years, he believed that the household moved according to his authority alone. The presence of the mistress had reinforced that confidence, surrounding him with attention and admiration that seemed to confirm his control. Now that the atmosphere has changed, the mistress no longer occupies the same visible place within his life. Allies who once supported his choices have grown cautious. Relatives and advisors have begun examining the household's affairs more closely. The structure of authority that once appeared effortless now requires justification. A man accustomed to unquestioned command often finds this transition unsettling. The habits of leadership remain, yet the response from those around him feels different. Decisions once accepted immediately now invite discussion. Actions once taken without explanation now require defense. Power, it turns out, was never entirely solitary. It depended on the willingness of others to recognize and reinforce it. When that willingness begins to fade, the illusion of absolute control disappears as well. Inside the household, this transformation becomes visible in small moments. A steward pauses before executing an order, requesting clarification. A visiting relative suggests reviewing certain financial arrangements before approving them. Even casual remarks during dinner hint that responsibility now belongs to more than one person. These moments accumulate quietly. They reshape the environment surrounding the husband's authority. And slowly, he begins to understand that the position he once considered unassailable now rests within a network of scrutiny, negotiation, and shared oversight. The household still bears his name, but the certainty that once defined his command has begun to dissolve. The husband gradually discovers that the authority he once exercised without challenge is now surrounded by watchful eyes and careful questions. Oversight of property, finance, and decisions begins to replace the unquestioned control he once enjoyed. In the quiet spaces of the household, the realization emerges that the power he believed to be absolute has already begun to slip from his hands. Separation within Tudor marriage rarely arrived as a sudden declaration. In a society where marriage carried religious authority and legal weight, dissolving or weakening that bond required careful preparation. The process unfolded slowly through documents, testimonies, and interpretations of law rather than emotional confrontation. Once the household had begun to shift away from the husband's unquestioned authority, the question of legal standing inevitably emerged. Marriage among the nobility was never simply a private relationship. It was a contract tied to land, inheritance, and alliances between families. Because of this, altering that contract demanded careful attention to the rules that governed property and duty. For the wife and her allies, the legal structure surrounding marriage offered possibilities. The law recognized obligations attached to the husband's position. A husband was expected to maintain the household's stability, protect the reputation of the marriage, and manage property responsibly. When those expectations appeared compromised, legal advisors could begin examining the situation through a different lens. Their task was not to create conflict, but to interpret whether existing behavior violated to established responsibilities. Careful reading of legal documents often revealed openings. Marriage settlements drafted at the beginning of the union might contain clauses protecting the wife's financial security. Certain lands or incomes might have been assigned to support her position should difficulties arise. Provisions concerning inheritance might specify how property would pass if the marriage encountered legal complications. These clauses were rarely designed for immediate use. Yet when circumstances changed, they could become highly significant. Advisors began reviewing such documents with patient attention. Every phrase written in legal language carried potential consequences. Words that once seemed routine now provided the framework for a different arrangement within the household. At the same time, evidence concerning the husband's conduct became increasingly relevant. In Tudor society, accusations alone rarely held legal weight. Courts required indications that obligations had been neglected or reputation had been damaged in ways that affected the household's integrity. Evidence might appear in many forms. Letters exchanged between the husband and the mistress could reveal patterns of behavior that undermined the dignity of the marriage. Financial records might demonstrate excessive spending connected to private indulgence. Witnesses within the household might recall events that suggested neglect of responsibilities or disregard for marital obligations. No single detail needed to prove everything. Instead, advisors assembled a collection of observations that together formed a persuasive narrative. Imagine a quiet consultation taking place in a chamber where legal documents lie across a large wooden table. A lawyer trained in ecclesiastical law reads through correspondence and financial records while listening to careful explanations from family representatives. The atmosphere remains calm. No voices are raised. No dramatic accusations fill the room. Instead, each piece of information is examined as part of a broader effort to understand whether the structure of the marriage still satisfies the expectations placed upon it. In Tudor England, the church possessed authority over many marital disputes. Ecclesiastical courts considered questions involving marital duty, legitimacy, and separation. Their decisions carried moral as well as legal influence, shaping how society viewed the individuals involved. This meant that any request for separation required a convincing moral framework. The wife's conduct, therefore, remained central. Her reputation for patience and restraint strengthened the credibility of any claims presented on her behalf. Observers who had watched the situation unfold quietly over time could see that she had not rushed toward confrontation. Instead, she had endured the strain while maintaining the dignity expected of her position. That image mattered greatly. It suggested that legal action arose not from anger but from necessity. Once advisors believed that the available evidence supported a formal challenge, they began shaping the legal argument carefully. Their goal was not to destroy the husband's reputation outright, but to establish conditions under which the wife's rights and security could be protected. Separation or annulment, when pursued in this manner, served a practical purpose. It created a framework that allowed the household's resources to be divided in ways that prevented further instability. Control of certain lands or incomes could be reassigned. Responsibility for managing property might shift into more reliable hands. The husband remained part of the structure, but the absolute authority he once exercised no longer defined the arrangement. From the outside, the process might appear slow and technical. Documents moved between lawyers and clerics. Witnesses offered statements that seemed measured and restrained. Discussions about inheritance and property dominated the conversation. Yet beneath this calm surface, the balance of power within the household was changing. Legal interpretation was transforming a private conflict into a formal restructuring of authority. Legal advisors begin to use marriage contracts and documented behavior to reshape the structure of the household's authority. Evidence concerning duty, fiancé, and reputation gradually forms the basis for redefining the terms of the marriage. Through quiet legal preparation, the foundation emerges for a separation that could permanently alter who controls the family's future. Inheritance stood at the heart of noble life in Tudor England. Land, titles, and family reputation were all carried forward through the next generation. A household's future depended not only on wealth or alliances, but on the careful upbringing of children who would eventually inherit responsibility for the family's name. Because of this, control over children carried enormous significance. For a wife, navigating the shifting balance of authority within her marriage, the question of guardianship and education became central. Whoever guided the next generation would influence not only the household's future character, but also the direction of its political and social alliances. Within Tudor law and custom, the father traditionally held considerable authority over his children. Yet that authority was not absolute when the stability of the household came into question. If doubts about a father's conduct began to circulate, relatives and advisors might begin discussing how best to protect the children's interests. These discussions rarely sounded dramatic. They often appeared as practical concerns about education and moral guidance. A noble family valued proper upbringing deeply. Sons were expected to learn discipline, estate management, and the political responsibilities attached to their inheritance. Daughters required preparation for marriages that would connect the household to other influential families. Ensuring that such training occurred within a stable environment became increasingly important once tensions inside the marriage had grown visible. Gradually, the wife's role in shaping the children's future gained greater attention. Her steady reputation for responsibility and moral discipline strengthened the argument that she should guide their upbringing. Relatives and advisors who already doubted the husband's judgment began to see the advantages of placing greater trust in the mother's oversight. The household's stability, after all, depended on preparing the next generation properly. Imagine a quiet morning within the family estate where the children gather in a study room under the supervision of tutors. Lessons in reading, Latin, and history unfold beside discussions about the responsibilities attached to noble birth. The wife occasionally enters the room to observe their progress. Her presence reinforces the idea that she oversees the formation of the family's future heirs. Tutors speak respectfully about her involvement, recognizing that she represents the continuity of lawful authority within the household. Meanwhile, the husband's influence over these routines begins to diminish. He may still appear during formal occasions or discussions concerning the estate, yet the daily structure of the children's education increasingly falls under the wife's supervision. Decisions about tutors, schedules, and moral instruction pass quietly through her hands. This shift does not necessarily require open conflict. Instead, it reflects a growing consensus among relatives and advisors that stability must guide the next generation. Inheritance itself adds another layer to the situation. Documents concerning the transfer of property often include provisions designed to protect the interests of legitimate heirs. Lawyers reviewing these arrangements may emphasize the importance of shielding those heirs from circumstances that could threaten their future claims. If the presence of a mistress within the household complicates matters, legal advisors may consider how best to prevent confusion regarding lineage or inheritance. Clarity becomes essential. Children born within a lawful marriage must be recognized clearly as the rightful heirs. Their upbringing, their education, and their association with the family name must remain free from controversy. Gradually, this emphasis reinforces the wife's position. By guiding the children's development, she embodies the continuity of the family line. Her authority over their upbringing symbolizes the preservation of legitimacy itself. At the same time, the mistress's influence begins to fade further. Without access to the spaces where the children are educated or raised, her connection to the household's future disappears almost entirely. She no longer shapes conversations about inheritance, alliances, or the training of heirs. Her presence becomes irrelevant to the continuation of the family line. Imagine an evening in the Great Hall where relatives gather for a quiet dinner. Discussion turns toward the children's progress in their studies and their prospects for future alliances. Several guests praise the discipline with which the household now prepares the heirs. They speak approvingly of the stability that surrounds the children's upbringing. In such conversations, the wife's authority appears natural and necessary. She is no longer simply the woman who endured a difficult marriage. She is the guardian of the family's future. The husband may still occupy his formal position within the household, yet the shaping of the next generation increasingly belongs to someone else. Through control of education, guidance of inheritance, and protection of legitimacy, the wife gradually secures the foundation upon which the family's future will stand. And, in Tudor society, whoever controlled that foundation controlled far more than the present moment. Responsibility for the children's education and inheritance quietly moves into the wife's hands as the household seeks stability. By guiding the next generation, she becomes the central figure, preserving the family's name and future alliances. As her authority over the heirs strengthens, the influence that once surrounded the husband and the mistress fades further into the background. Power inside a Tudor household did not always belong to the person who held the loudest voice. Authority often settled around the individual who appeared capable of maintaining order when uncertainty threatened to unravel the structure of family life. Stability, more than ambition, determined who ultimately guided the direction of the household. By the time tensions within the marriage had passed through so many quiet transformations, the balance of influence had already begun to move. The wife, once perceived merely as the patient figure, enduring humiliation within her own household, now occupied a different position in the eyes of those around her. Observers noticed how calmly she had preserved the household's routines while conflict unfolded behind the walls of the estate. Servants still carried out their tasks with discipline. The children continued their education without interruption. The estate's lands remained managed and productive. Such consistency created a powerful impression. Where others saw disorder, she had preserved structure. Gradually, this perception allowed her to step into a more visible role within the management of the estate. The transition did not require dramatic declarations. Instead, it emerged through practical necessity. Financial records required oversight. Agricultural production demanded coordination. Correspondence with neighboring estates and court officials required attention. Someone needed to manage these responsibilities. As advisors and relatives examined the situation carefully, they recognized that the wife had already demonstrated the discipline required for such duties. Her familiarity with the household's daily operations allowed her to guide the estate with a steadiness that reassured those who depended on its stability. Within a short time, her presence in discussions concerning the estate's management became increasingly natural. Imagine a morning in the estate's main hall where stewards present their reports. Lists of harvest yields, rents collected from tenant farmers, and repairs needed on distant lands lie across the long wooden table. The wife listens carefully while each steward speaks. Questions follow, calm and deliberate. She asks about the condition of fields damaged by recent storms. She inquires about the progress of repairs on a mill that supports several nearby villages. Her attention to detail demonstrates that she understands the estate not merely as property, but as a living system that sustains many lives. Those present begin to recognize something important. The household continues to function because someone has assumed responsibility for its direction. At the same time, her presence beyond the estate slowly begins to change as well. Visits to neighboring families, appearances at church gatherings, and occasional attendance at court events allow her to rebuild the household's reputation in wider circles. Conversations that once centered on scandal now shift toward admiration for the stability she has preserved. In Tudor society, reputation traveled quickly. A woman who demonstrated composure during a crisis could earn a form of respect that even formal authority could not command. Noble families who had once watched the household's difficulties with curiosity now began to speak of the wife as someone capable of maintaining dignity under pressure. This new image strengthened her position further. At court, where reputation often determined influence, such perceptions carried considerable weight. Officials and advisors valued stability within noble families because instability threatened broader political alliances. A household guided by calm leadership reassured those who relied upon it. Gradually, The narrative surrounding the marriage transformed. What had once appeared to be a story of betrayal and conflict began to resemble something else entirely, a demonstration of resilience and control. The wife no longer appeared as a victim of circumstances, but as the figure who restored order when others had allowed disorder to grow. This shift in perception proved powerful. The husband, once the unquestioned center of authority, now found his influence overshadowed by the steadiness of the woman who had preserved the household during its most uncertain moments. Servants, advisors, and relatives increasingly turned toward her judgment when decisions required careful thought. Authority had not been seized through confrontation. It had emerged through competence. The mistress, who once disrupted the balance of the household, had already disappeared from its public life. The husband's authority, weakened through scrutiny and legal pressure, now existed beside a figure whose leadership appeared more reliable. Power no longer resided where it once had. Instead, it gathered quietly around the person who ensured that the household endured. And in Tudor society, endurance often proved the strongest foundation for authority. The woman who once endured humiliation now appears as the steady guardian of the household's order and prosperity. Her calm management of the estate and renewed reputation at court transform a crisis into an opportunity for authority. In the quiet halls of the manor, a new center of power emerges, where few once expected to find it. Inside a Tudor household, the transformation of power rarely began with a single dramatic moment. Authority did not always collapse through open confrontation or loud declarations. More often, it changed through a long sequence of quiet adjustments that slowly altered how everyone within the household understood who truly guided its direction. For years, the wife had occupied a position shaped by endurance. Visitors who came to the estate had seen her seated calmly at the great table during meals. Her expression composed even when conversations carried unspoken tension. Servants moving quietly through the corridors noticed the same restraint. She continued to oversee the household's routines without visible anger or desperation. To many observers, that calm silence seemed like weakness. In Tudor society, visible authority often belonged to those who spoke loudly, made decisive gestures, and commanded attention in public spaces. A husband who entertained companions, gave orders to servants, and moved confidently through court gatherings appeared to embody that authority. Meanwhile, the wife appeared still. She did not confront the mistress publicly. She did not argue loudly in the halls or at dinners. She did not attempt to humiliate anyone in front of witnesses. At first glance, this quiet behavior seemed like submission, yet silence, in reality, had been something else entirely. While the household's attention followed scandal and whispers, the wife had been preserving something far more important: structure. The routines of the estate remained intact. The children continued their lessons. Financial matters were handled carefully. Guests were still received with dignity. The outward order of the household never collapsed. This stability slowly changed how others interpreted the situation. Relatives who visited the estate began noticing that while rumors about the husband spread beyond the walls of the manor, the wife herself remained composed and disciplined. Servants who watched daily life inside the household realized that the estate functioned smoothly because she continued guiding its routines. Gradually, the image surrounding her shifted. Instead of appearing powerless, she appeared resilient. Imagine an evening gathering in the Great Hall during the colder months of the year. Candles flicker against stone walls, while several advisors discuss matters concerning land disputes and tenant obligations. The husband sits among them, listening carefully. For years, such discussions would have revolved entirely around his decisions. Yet something has changed. A steward, presenting information about the estate, pauses and turns slightly toward the wife when a question arises regarding the management of certain lands. The movement seems natural, almost instinctive. Others in the room follow the same direction with their eyes. They wait for her response. She speaks calmly, Her voice carries no anger, no visible attempt to assert dominance. Instead, she discusses the importance of maintaining fairness with tenants and ensuring that harvest revenues remain stable for the coming year. Her explanation is practical and measured. Those listening nod in agreement. No one announces that authority has shifted, yet everyone present understands the significance of the moment. The wife's judgment now carries weight within the household. This transformation changes the emotional perception surrounding her role as well. Earlier whispers had framed her as the injured party in a troubled marriage. People spoke about her with sympathy, sometimes with pity. The story seemed simple. A woman betrayed by her husband and overshadowed by another woman. But time has altered that narrative. Now the household's stability appears closely connected to her discipline. The estate functions because she protects its structure. The children's future remains secure because she ensures their education continues. The reputation of the family survives because she refuses to create a scandal. What once looked like weakness now appears strategic. Even the husband begins to recognize the change. The atmosphere surrounding his authority feels different from what it once was. Decisions that once passed unquestioned now receive careful evaluation from advisors and relatives. Conversations increasingly involve the wife's perspective. This shift does not occur through rebellion. It occurs through recognition. Authority has moved toward the person who preserved order, while others allowed disorder to grow. Within Tudor society, that difference matters greatly. Power often belongs not to the loudest voice, but to the individual capable of sustaining continuity when chaos threatens to break the structure of family life. The wife now embodies that role. She is no longer perceived merely as the woman who endured betrayal. Instead, she appears as the figure who guided the household through uncertainty and restored its stability. Her transformation does not require a dramatic celebration. It becomes visible through everyday behavior. Servants listen when she speaks. Advisors consult her judgment. Relatives trust her presence to maintain the family's dignity. Without raising her voice, she has become the center around which the household now turns. The woman who once endured betrayal now stands as the steady force directing the household's future. Silence that once appeared passive reveals itself as the quiet preparation for decisive authority. In the stillness of the manor halls, the one once treated as powerless has become the figure others now follow. Time does not simply erase the consequences of conflict inside a Tudor household, even when the most visible tensions disappear. The stronger effects of what happened continue to shape the lives of those who remain. A household that has endured scandal and quiet political struggle rarely returns to exactly what it once was. Instead, it becomes something different. After the mistress has vanished from public view and the husband's authority has been restrained by law, family alliances, and social pressure, the household begins a slow process of reconstruction. The outward structure remains the same. The manor still stands. The lands still stretch across fields and villages. And the family name continues to carry its long history. Yet the relationships inside that structure have changed permanently. The wife now occupies the position that stabilizes the household's daily life. Servants, advisors, and relatives increasingly recognize her as the person responsible for maintaining order and continuity. Decisions regarding estate management, family alliances, and the education of heirs now revolve around her judgment. This transformation brings a form of stability. For the wider community, the household appears restored. Neighbors, once curious about the scandal, now speak about the family's renewed discipline. Visitors arriving at the estate encounter a calm environment where routines unfold predictably. Agricultural work continues. Tenants meet their obligations, and the estate once again appears reliable. Reputation, in Tudor society, depends heavily on appearances. The family's dignity slowly rebuilds through repeated demonstrations of order. Invitations from neighboring households return. Clergy speak approvingly of the household's stability. Even distant relatives begin referring to the family as an example of resilience rather than scandal. Honor, once threatened by whispers, gradually returns. Yet beneath this restored image, something more complicated remains. Trust, once damaged, rarely repairs itself completely. The husband continues to live within the household, but the nature of his authority has changed forever. His name still appears on official documents, and he may still participate in certain formal decisions. However, the confidence that once surrounded him has faded. Advisors now observe his choices more carefully. Relatives remain attentive to how estate affairs are handled. Conversations that once treated his leadership as unquestionable now include careful consideration from others. He remains part of the household structure, but he no longer stands alone at its center. For the wife, the consequences are equally complex. Her authority has grown stronger than it ever was before. She manages the estate's operations, oversees the education of her children, and guides the family's social alliances. People respect her discipline and recognize the role she played in preserving the household during its most unstable period. Yet that authority comes at a cost. The emotional foundation of the marriage cannot return to its earlier form. The trust that once supported the partnership between husband and wife has been replaced by something more practical. Cooperation now exists, not through affection but through necessity. Their relationship becomes one defined by structure rather than intimacy. Imagine a quiet evening inside the manor's great hall. Years after the conflict has faded from public conversation, the family gathers for supper beneath the familiar glow of candlelight. The children speak about their studies and the future responsibilities they will one day inherit. The husband listens quietly. The wife sits across the table, guiding the conversation when necessary and ensuring that the household continues to move forward. The atmosphere remains calm and respectful. Yet a subtle distance exists between them. No one speaks about the past, but its presence lingers within the room. For the children growing up inside this environment, the lessons are complex. They observe a household that survived a crisis through discipline and patience. They see how reputation can be damaged and then restored through careful behavior. At the same time, they sense the quiet boundaries that now shape the relationship between their parents. The household teaches them something important about power. Authority, they learn, does not always emerge from strength alone. It often arises from resilience, from the ability to endure turmoil while preserving the structures that allow a family to continue. The wife embodies that lesson through patience, preparation, and strategic alliances. She transformed a position of humiliation into one of leadership. The household remains intact because she ensured its survival when others allowed instability to grow. Yet the scars of that struggle remain hidden within the structure she preserved. The mistress has disappeared from the story entirely, her presence reduced to distant memory. The husband's authority survives only in a modified form. And the wife, though now recognized as the stabilizing center of the household, carries the quiet knowledge that the path to that position required enduring betrayal. Power has been restored, but innocence has not. The household appears stable once more, its reputation rebuilt, and its future secured through discipline and careful leadership. Yet the quiet restructuring of authority has permanently altered the relationships that define the family's life. Beneath the calm surface of restored honor, a question remains about what true power ultimately costs. The great halls of Tudor houses often looked unchanged, even after the fiercest struggles for power had quietly ended. Stone walls remained where they had always stood. Tapestries still hung beside tall windows. Servants continued their duties, as if nothing remarkable had ever happened inside those rooms. From the outside, the household appeared calm. Visitors arriving at the estate might see a family gathered around the supper table, children discussing lessons with their tutors, and stewards presenting reports about harvests and rents. The rhythm of noble life continued exactly as tradition demanded. Yet the balance of power inside the household had shifted in ways that could not easily be seen. The mistress who once disrupted the marriage had vanished completely from the story. Her name no longer circulated through conversations in the manor corridors. No servants carried messages to hidden rooms. No visitors asked quiet questions about her presence. She had simply disappeared. Some said she married elsewhere and settled into a quieter life, far from court. Others believed she lived in the countryside, where few remembered the household she once nearly changed forever. Whatever the truth, she no longer belonged to the world of the estate. The husband remained. His name still appeared on official documents. His title still connected the household to its long line of ancestors. To outsiders, he still represented the family's authority in formal matters. But time had altered the meaning of that authority. The confidence that once surrounded him had faded into something quieter and more cautious. Decisions that once passed through his hands alone now moved through a wider circle of advisors and relatives. His voice still mattered, but it no longer carried the absolute certainty it once had. Even the servants sensed the difference. Inside great houses, servants often noticed subtle shifts in power before anyone spoke about them openly. They observed who gave instructions, who asked the final questions during meetings with him, and whose presence guided the daily rhythm of the estate. Increasingly, those signals pointed towards someone else. The wife. She moved through the halls with the same calm discipline she had always shown. Her routines remained simple: reviewing household accounts, overseeing the education of the children, speaking with stewards about land and harvests. Yet everyone understood that the stability of the household now depended on her judgment. Imagine an early morning in the estate courtyard, where stewards gather to present reports about tenant obligations and winter preparations. The wife stands beside a table covered with parchment documents. Her questions are measured and practical. She asks about the repair of barns damaged by storms. She reviews records of grain storage for the coming months. She considers how the estate should support villages during difficult seasons. The stewards respond carefully. They speak to her not out of obligation, but out of recognition that her guidance now shapes the household's direction. Authority has settled quietly around her presence. No proclamation announced this transformation. No ceremony declared her the central figure of the household. The change occurred gradually, through patience and endurance, until it simply became the natural order of things. The children growing up within the estate understand this reality instinctively. They see their mother guiding tutors, organizing family alliances, and maintaining the household's dignity in public life. They hear visitors speak respectfully about her discipline and composure. Through these observations, they learn what true authority looks like. It is not loud. It does not always appear through dramatic gestures or displays of command. Instead, it reveals itself through consistency, responsibility, and the ability to preserve order when others allow disorder to grow. Yet even this restored stability carries a quiet tension. The marriage itself continues to exist, but its meaning has changed forever. The husband and wife share the same household, speak politely during family gatherings, and cooperate in matters concerning their children. But the emotional foundation that once defined their union cannot be rebuilt. Trust, once broken, rarely returns unchanged. Imagine a late evening inside the manor hall, long after the servants have withdrawn, and the candles burn low. The wife sits alone beside a window overlooking the estate lands. Outside, the fields stretch into darkness beneath a quiet sky. Everything appears peaceful. The household survives. The children's future is secure. The estate continues to function with order and dignity. From every practical perspective, the power struggle has ended successfully. Yet silence fills the room. The wife understands what this victory required. She endured humiliation, watched alliances shift, and patiently rebuilt the structure of authority around herself. The household stands because she refused to allow it to collapse. But victory carries its own form of solitude. Power has returned to the family. Yet the cost of securing it cannot be forgotten. And perhaps that is the final truth of such stories. In Tudor society, authority often emerged not from those who demanded it loudly, but from those who endured quietly until the moment arrived to reshape the world around them. Tonight, as the great house rests in silence and the candles fade into darkness, the woman who once endured betrayal sits at the center of the household she saved. Her enemies have vanished. Her authority is unquestioned, and the quiet night surrounding the manor holds the final lesson of this story. Power does not always belong to the one who begins the struggle. Sometimes it belongs to the one who waits long enough to finish it. Thank you for listening to this story of quiet power and hidden battles within the world of Tudor marriage. History often remembers kings, wars, and crowns. Yet the lives inside noble households reveal a different kind of struggle. One fought with patience, reputation, and careful strategy. I hope this journey through the shadows of Tudor family life has offered a glimpse into how power could move silently behind stone walls and candlelit halls. Now the house grows still, the corridors empty, and the voices of the day fade into rest. So wherever you are listening tonight, allow the story to drift gently into the quiet of the evening. Close your eyes. Let the echoes of history settle softly in your thoughts, and may the calm of the night bring you peaceful dreams. Good night.